We're joined for some analysis now by Bulelwa Mabasa, Director and Head of Land Reform, Restitution and Tenure Practice at Werksmans Attorneys. Thank you for being with us. Just your first take on this idea, this proposal that white commercial farmers, presumably they are the object here, be asked to donate land to black emerging farmers.
Thank you for having me. I think for just a little bit of context, it's important to outline the genesis of this outcome. When I was a member of the Presidential Advisory Panel in 2019, one of the big ideas that I put on the table at the time was the idea of land donations. And that came as a result of my being in practice as an attorney, being approached by various landowners, farmers and organizations who were interested to find out what the policy is in terms of interested people that want to become part of the land reform program, people that want to see themselves as part of the solution in the greater land reform project. And what had appeared to me at the time was that we lacked a policy direction or some kind of a policy or law that would regulate how those land donations could happen. So at the time that suggestion was made, in fact, it became part of the recommendations that we made as part of the Presidential Advisory Panel, and it was not necessarily something that we centered around white commercial farmers. That was something that was hinged upon a social contract of sorts that would allow anyone who felt that they had excess land, who felt that they wanted to become part of the solution and to make land available for land reform purposes, and also not just for black commercial farmers, but land available for example, farm workers or any other sectors of society that were interested in land development. Yeah. And so that was a genesis, in my view, of this suggestion. Of course, we have seen...
This is so interesting, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but I really want to know, because we've heard again and again that some of the big commercial farmers want to give land, but in return they want to know that there will be no expropriation down the line, so they get security on what is remaining. Is that a factor here at all?
Look, I don't think that should be a valid factor at all, because as you are aware, nothing stops government at this particular stage, with or without a constitutional amendment, to find those circumstances that are appropriate for land expropriation without compensation. And we've said this as part of the advisory land reform panel, to say that where there is land that is not in use currently, or where there is land where there hasn't been capital investments, or where there is no basis for that current use of land, that government is able at this point to utilize that land for purposes of land without expropriation. We do accept, and I do accept, that those circumstances will be few and far between, because only that land that does not have, for example, market value would qualify for land without expropriation without compensation. But I think the important bit here is that the issue of land without compensation, without land expropriation without compensation, should not be seen as some kind of a trade-off to making land available. Instead, I think that it still forms part and parcel of a larger land reform project, and that it is not only the issue of expropriation without compensation that is the perceived failure of land reform. There's so many other things, along with providing land, that government should be doing. Things like securing tenure of people that don't have protected, secure tenure rights, such as farm workers, such as people that live on rural land that hasn't been surveyed. So I think it's important to understand that even if we were to have this program or some kind of a policy that says that commercial farmers could make land available to black emerging farmers, that on its own is not going to be the magic trick, but that it also, along with that, has to go with things like securing land tenure, things like making sure that there is the Commission of Restitution of Land Rights Act is fully functional and that it's well resourced, and that we still have the redistribution bill that looks at a policy or law that should guide who gets that land, how they get that land, and where that land is. So there are a lot of moving targets here that would still need to be in place.
So you bring me to my next question, and I'm interested that you were championing this idea of donations at one stage. There has been some criticism, political criticism, reportedly from the RET faction in the ANC, saying, okay, we failed with expropriation, now we're going begging for land from white farmers. But an analyst on this show said recently that his criticism was that this is an ad hoc, it's a once-off, it seems pretty reactionary. It displays a lack of systematic thinking about land that has been displayed by the ANC for years. Do you agree?
Well, as I said, I don't believe that it is one or the other. I don't think this is about dualism. It's not about if you choose land donation, it means that you dump expropriation without compensation. As I said, these things are things that should be working together, that should form part of a strategic and a shift in how we see land reform in the future. And, you can still have a policy of land donations without doing away with expropriation without compensation. And of course, you still need to have a policy, a beneficiary and land allocation policy that tells us who owns the land in South Africa, what purpose is there, whether or not government, what strategic input does government have in terms of, for example, things like land for mining or land for exploration and so forth, and land for tourism. Yeah. So you've got to look at these things as moving targets that ultimately have to work together towards a unified, redefined land reform program without seeking to be dualistic and say, well, it's one or the other.
Finally, the Justice Minister says that they're not abandoning expropriation without compensation, but they're now looking at a normal law, which needs a majority, not a two-thirds majority, because they failed in changing the Constitution. But that would mean surely that all the wrangling that we've seen for years has been for nothing, which I guess is what you and others have been saying, that the Constitution already allows for it.
Absolutely. And I think, the fact that we still don't have an expropriation act that is framed along the lines of the Constitution is one area where government has failed. Another area where government has failed, as I said, is that we still don't have a redistribution law which would tell us who qualifies for land and under what circumstances they qualify for land, and to have transparency around it. Because what we've seen in the last almost 3 decades now has been government's tendency to utilize internal policies of government where land is given to certain people without there being a law that would allow the transparency, the checks and balances that you would have in any form of legislation. So I think that there's been an over-emphasis and politicizing of this issue of expropriation without compensation, as if that would be the pariah, as if that would be the magic bullet to solve all problems. And as we know, we've seen that even with the state institutions that are meant to be driving and implementing our land reform projects, they have been under-resourced. They don't get the enough fiscal support that we need. So I don't believe that the getting a normal law on expropriation compensation or without compensation would be what would deliver true land reform in the meaningful way.
All right, I hope we can chat again. Thank you very much for that insight. Bulelwa Mabasa, Director and Head of Land Reform, Restitution and Tenure Practice at Werksmans Attorneys.